right now is contextualized in design experiments through digital technologies. I mean, you guys are all right now struggling with the software to make strange shapes, right? And you are struggling with your intellect to understand how these spaces really work, what these spaces really are. And I mean, how are these spaces that are now in your computer and your 3D printed models really going to be used? What are these spaces and why are we doing them and not only proceeding to produce boxes like most of the architecture you see around you? These questions are certainly valid, and to assist your thinking in answering these questions, I believe that we need to look back in history to discuss the essence of your design experiments, what they really are. I mean, they are basically space and geometry, right? We need to think about the new spaces you design. We need to trace a trajectory of space making in architecture to understand that architects always have been striving to produce new kinds of spaces. And society will always subsequently need them. And space has always been created in geometry. So thus, the purpose of this lecture is twofold. It is to provide new knowledge and contextualize your digital design experiments in the history and the discipline of architecture. And it's also to provide you with theoretical models and concepts that will help you to think around and find yourself in these new spaces and geometries, which you hopefully will advance, I mean, also after the course have ended in June. And I do start with this photograph that I took when I was living and working in Beirut, which is a construction site of a Zaha Hadid department store. I think this building kind of demonstrates that spaces that you all are designing today are actually being built and constructed. That it's nothing strange with them. And what seems impossible today may become the norm of tomorrow. So this lecture will be based on a couple of readings that you have been working on for today and reading for today. And we will start with a chapter in Siegfried Gideon's Space-Time in Architecture, Art, Architecture and Construction, in his canonical book, Space-Time and Architecture, The Growth of a New Tradition, which all of you should have kind of read a little bit of. Gideon, he starts the chapter by making the case that we have lost track with our feelings and emotions. He argued, and I'm quoting him from the article that you've read, a good share of the misfortunes in the past century came out of its belief that industry and techniques have only a functional import with no emotional content. So in the article, Gideon, he blames the alienation to our feelings and emotions on the separation between art and science. He says that art and science should be the same, but that the two have been separated. So here we have two pictures, one of Jackson Pollock, the artist, and one of Jack Harron with an assistant, Eric Rigg, which are scientists. Many of us and many of the people in society, I guess, wouldn't consider Jackson Pollock's action paintings being as successful to societal progression as Jack Harron's lab tests. But the truth is that they really are. And it's a misfortunate disconnection between art and science that often renders Pollock's experiments and paintings less important than Harron's lab tests. And this split between art and science is particularly problematic for architecture, because architecture is both. Architecture comes from the arts, but it needs science. Good architecture signifies harmony between the two, between art and science. And still, as Gideon so clearly claims in his article, art is all too often repressed in society and also in architecture. For Gideon, the repressed feelings and emotions in modern society encompasses a serious problem. He says that no level of development can be maintained if it remains detached from our emotional life. And he uses Cubist art to show that feelings and emotions captured in ordinary things such as pipes and bottles and glasses, guitars, etc., can actually reveal a new world. And he argues that these discoveries can only be made by artists. And I'm going to quote him here from the article when he says that the artist, in fact, functions a great deal like an inventor or a scientific discoverer. All three seek new relations between man and his world. In the artist's case, the relations are emotional instead of practical or cognitive. The creative artist does not want to copy his surroundings, on the other hand, or to make us see them through his eyes, or the other. He's a specialist who shows us in his work as if in a mirror something we had not realized for ourselves, the state of our own souls. And I argue that Gideon's statement resonates uncannily with today's discourse. Construction today in Sweden and elsewhere is most often quantitative. We have a lack of quality in architecture and in city building, just like Gideon argued in this article published more than 50 years ago. And the evaluation methods that we do use in agencies, construction sites, they often fail, or they tend to fail to comprehend experiments or experimental practices, which while current dilemmas certainly demands solution beyond the status quo of architecture. Gideon, he makes use of the art movement Cubism to show one discovery that artists have made that changes both our lives and our architecture. And he's saying, now I'm quoting him, the method of presenting spatial relationships with the Cubist developed led in the 1910s up to the form-giving principles of a new space conception. Thus, it was Cubist artists that were able to give form to a new conception of space. And that radically changed society, if we listen to Gideon, and the way society understands the world. So I won't give you a lecture on Cubism here, but if these paintings that we see here, if they prove that we can give form to a new conception of space, I mean, how does these paintings really challenge the old conception of space? And what is the old conception of space? That forms the main core of this lecture, to provide some kind of answer to this, or understanding to this for you. To explain the old conception of space, the Renaissance perspective is a good framework for exploration. Because this conception of space is the conception of space that still comply with the way we think about space. And Gideon, he says in the article that from the Renaissance to the first decade of the present century, which was the 20th century, perspective had been one of the most important constituents of facts in painting. And I assume all of you know what the Renaissance is, so I won't go into that. But what is interesting with the Renaissance perspective, and what is specific with it, is that it used mathematics to explain the laws of the perspective. I mean, the Renaissance perspective is an innovation. It is a construction. It's a construction of how to perceive space. It uses the laws of Euclidean geometry to construct an image of the world as if we see it on a flat surface. It's a naturalist representation of the world as we see it, right? It has a depth in the image. It has a foreground and a background. There is and this is important, there is a dialectical relationship between us as subject that are looking at the world and the surrounding world as an object. And this is created from a vertical posture. It's from a vertical picture plane. The Renaissance perspective is produced vertically. It communicates to you when you stand up vertically to look at it. And the Renaissance perspective was one of the founding members of architecture discipline during the Renaissance era. It was through the Renaissance perspective that architecture became a discipline. And I will explain that a little more in a little bit. The Renaissance perspective used the laws of Euclidean geometry to construct representation. So who was Euclid, and what is Euclidean geometry? Well, I took this picture, which is a little small here. It's a beautiful perspective, actually. Beautiful Renaissance perspective made by Raphael. It's called the School of Athens, and it's painted in the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican, where you have Plato and Aristotle in the middle. Plato, who is a teacher, and Aristotle, who is a pupil of Plato. Plato points upwards, talking about his divine ideas, about the hidden truths. And Aristotle says, no, take it easy. You have to be more pragmatic. We can't talk about these dreams and stuff. This really captures the essence of the kind of the practices that goes on today. And the surrounding figures in this painting, there are some notorious and canonical figures. One of them is Euclid. If you look to the right corner, you see a man bending over with a compass, explaining geometry by drawing on the ground. That is Euclid. He was a Greek mathematician, often referred to as the founder of geometry and the father of geometry. He was active in Alexandria around 300 before the Common Era, and he wrote the book Elements, which was one of the most influential books on mathematics and geometry up to the late 19th century, after the Common Era. And I won't go through this. He postulated kind of five axioms. These axioms were considered universal truths, meaning that they are always true, these 5 axioms. And then the one that was kind of broken in the 19th century was the parallel postulate. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but these truths were used to kind of propel ideas about geometry into the first century. And during the representation of space after Euclid, I mean, the knowledge about geometry was there, but we didn't really know. We didn't have any technique of how to use geometry to represent the space. I mean, the depth in an image. We see here in this medieval painting, it's a canonical painting that you may have encountered in different texts about cities and representation. We can see that it's a rather flat image. I mean, there is a hint about the 3-dimensionality, but it's difficult to see this depth, right? We can't measure in this image. We don't really know what is the foreground and where is the background, because it's not drawn to the laws of the perspective. And the naturalistic representation of space through the perspective drawing, it started in Venice in Italy, kind of in the Middle Ages. And it was talked about, or it is talked about today as a painterly perspective. Here there became an explicit introduction of depth into the picture plane. We see a foreground and a background. We can read depth and geometries in this picture. And the implementation of the perspective had a tremendous impact on the way the world was perceived during the Middle Ages. And truly recommend you to read Orhan Pamuk's great book, My Name is Red, later on in summertime. It really explains these processes, that the kind of power that the Painterly perspective, the idea of the perspective introduced in the world during the Middle Ages and early kind of Renaissance. But if we compare the Painterly perspective with the Renaissance perspective, you definitely see differences. I mean, the Renaissance perspective is much more precise. It's a mathematical explanation of the Painterly perspective, which provides you an explicit idea about space. I mean, you may argue that it's more sterile. I'm completely fine with that, and that the Renaissance perspective is more dynamic. I mean, these things can be argued. But what the Renaissance perspective made is to make the construction through geometry and mathematics. It explains the perspective through mathematics, through Euclid's ideas about the geometry. And we see here in Duver's woodcuts how this drawing is a construction, and it was a tremendous revolution when this came about, because what this did was that it kind of shaped our understanding of space, but it also provided a means of representing space which was mathematically exact, which meant that we could start to measure in the drawing to know how much a meter is, how much a kilometer is. I mean, the Renaissance perspective laid the foundation, for example, for the practices of subdividing land. So, I mean, if they had any Nobel Prizes back in those days, I mean, the guys who, like Alberti and Brunelleschi, who explained the perspective through mathematics and geometry, they would definitely get the Nobel Prize for this innovation. And if we look at the pre-perspective of the Middle Ages now and compare that with the perspective, and we think about how this has changed our idea about understanding space, we can see that in the pre-perspective here we have an excerpt of a 13th century painting where we see how the representation of space is flat. We can't see any background. We don't really know what the foreground and the background is, and there is a lack of depth. It's a space that we can't really perceive as a representation of space. It's more like a flat image of a situation, right? When we move into the Renaissance with Leonardo's Mona Lisa, we immediately get the depth. We get the foreground, the background. We get the posture, the vertical posture of the image. It illustrates for us, it gives us a perception of space, an idea about how to understand space. And this understanding is transferred to our century. We see here in Libonovich's famous photo scholar Johansson, how it's the same rules that plays on representation, right? We understand these two spaces in a similar manner, completely different from the pre-perspective understanding about space. And for architecture, the introduction of the Renaissance perspective, the knowledge about how to measure in a drawing, which the Renaissance perspective introduced, made it possible for architects to make a drawing with a scale that could be sent to the construction site as an instruction on how to build a building. So this is the first building that was produced, where part of the building was produced only through instructions made by the drawing. So here, when Alberti was designing this addition to the San Francisco at the Rimini, he was quite old. He was sick. He couldn't travel to the building site. Thus, he sent drawings to the construction site in order to build the building. And that is the first time that we know where architects provided the instructions of how to construct a building through representation, through the drawing. Before this church, the architect was always on site, drawing in sand, providing different kinds of representations to the contractors. But here, with this building, architects could become detached from the site. Somehow problematic, but it can also create the foundation of architecture as a discipline and architecture as a profession, as we know it today. When we send construction to, when we send the instruction through drawings and through documentations for the actual building, the construction of the buildings. I mean, drawing on the Euclidean geometry, in the 17th century, the French philosopher René Descartes invented the Cartesian coordinates. And when he did this, he provided the first systematic link between Euclidean geometry and algebra. And we all know about these Cartesian geometries. And every time you open AutoCAD or Rhino, for that example, for that matter, you have these coordinates. This coordinate system, the Cartesian coordinate system, or gave us ways of explaining geometric shapes such as curves through Cartesian equations. And it also gave us knowledge to outline volumes or position volumes in space, to calculate this space according to its position in X, Y, Z location in space. And it may be argued that the Cartesian geometry really finalizes the three-dimensional space of the Renaissance. And it closes a gap between mathematics and the representation of space. And it provides means of explaining Euclidean geometry through algebra. And that became a necessary means for computation later on. But we also understand here space and the underlying truth of Euclid, because this way of thinking about space, about constructing space, is still with us. I mean, it's a kind of normative truth. It's a universal truth about how to design and orchestrate space that the Cartesian geometry really anchors for us. But when we then move into the 19th century, the Renaissance, we see how this truth, or this idea of the universal truth implicit in Euclidean geometry and in the Cartesian system, it must be challenged. This truth doesn't really hold anymore. And Gideon writes about this. He writes that the three-dimensional space of the Renaissance is a space of Euclidean geometry. At about 1830, a new sort of geometry was created, one which differed from that of Euclid in employing more than three dimensions. So, what is all this about? I mean, what is happening here in the 19th century when we start to see that it's not really true? I mean, the Euclidean geometry is not universal truth. The Renaissance perspective doesn't always carry out what it has to carry out. We need alternatives. You have all read the text by Deleuze and Guattari about the smooth and the striated space. And in that text, they write about the maritime traveler during the 19th century and how the Riemannian geometry was developed in order to be able to measure the distances for the traveler, for the trades along the routes from London to Jakarta to Hong Kong, and where new geometries were needed in order to measure the travel distances, which had an economical impact through the trade systems of the 19th century. And
one basically discovered during this trace that Euclidean geometry wasn't really providing exact answers to these distances, and new ways of calculating space, new ways of calculating the trade routes were needed. Thus, new knowledge about geometry was needed to understand how to calculate certain areas on the globe, on a sphere surface. So we see here the Euclidean triangle, where the three corners or the three angles always become 180, and we see the Riemannian triangle, where these three corners not necessarily is 180. And here the fifth axiom of Euclid is challenged. Here it breaks. The universal truth of the Euclidean geometry breaks here in the 19th century. And for Gideon, in his article, he goes to, so he's interested in this, Gideon, and he goes to Picasso and back to Cubism here to discuss the first significant form-giving principle of a new space conception that breaks with the space conception evolved through the Renaissance perspective. And Picasso used his art to introduce an alternative to Euclidean geometry, according to Gideon's text. Gideon, he writes that Cubism breaks with the Renaissance perspective. It views objects relatively, that is, from several points of view, no one of which has exclusive authority, and in so dissecting objects, it seems that simultaneously from all sides, from above and below, from inside and outside, it goes around and into its objects. Thus, to the three dimensions of the Renaissance, which have held good as constituting facts throughout so many centuries, there is added a fourth one, time. So if all of you, so this is a bit difficult to comprehend perhaps, but I think if all of you that are listening to this lecture and see me and see this screen, if you put up your finger and block out the right eye of Picasso's woman here on the portrait. So if you hold up your finger like this and just put out the right eye, you will get her profile. And if you put up your finger and block out the left eye and the area around her mouth, you will get her portrait, just like Mona Lisa. So this is a way that Gideon is interested in how Picasso challenges the truth of the Euclidean geometry, and he's doing that through Cubism. So through Cubism, we can talk about the pre-perspective, perspective, and post-perspective. This is a means of understanding and representing space beyond the laws of Euclidean geometry and the Renaissance perspective. Gideon, he elaborates on the artistic means of emerging after Cubism, of this new space-time perception, and he particularly talks about Constructivism. I also anticipate that all of you know what Constructivism is, a Russian movement in art and architecture, in geometry and theater. And the constructivist architects and artists were really influenced by Cubism. We see here a comparison between Picasso's guitar and Tatlin's relief. I mean, Tatlin traveled to Picasso, met with him in Paris. The influence of Cubism were quite explicit in Constructivism, and there were a number of important figures here. Vladimir Tatlin is one of them. He was very interested in the tectonics of architecture, the materiality, and the structures, and the structural elements of architecture. He inserted the diagonal
as a significant element of the design to kind of signify the fourth dimension. I mean, time as a fourth dimension of space. And he was also very interested in the kinetic parts of architecture, which Tobias may find interesting when he thinks about his project. This project here, the Monument to the Third International from 1920, was a proposal for a huge building with 3 rotating parts in the building, like 3 houses that were supposed to rotate like clocks inside of this tower. Thus, an idea, if you're out there, to think about the kinetics in your architecture and how to make that come through. We also had Alexander Rodchenko, artist and architect. He was a pupil to Tatlin, and he worked primarily as a teacher at the Constructivist school. You may also find quite important photographs by Rodchenko. He became an important photographer. And we have Konstantin Melnikov, perhaps the constructivist that was building the most. You have his own house to the right here in the image, and to the very left you have his pavilion that he built in Paris at the same time when Le Corbusier built his L'Esprit Nouveau pavilion, which became the canonical kind of example of his architecture. Another figure in this context that is important to know about is Konstantin Melnikov. Melnikov was not a constructivist; he was a suprematist, which was different from the constructivism. Suprematism refused to limit artistic expression in accordance with tectonic structural constraints. And they were really focused on expressing the fourth dimension in space. Here in the model, we see no materials expressed, no joints are really expressed, which was very kind of symptomatic about the suprematist thinking about architecture. I mean, the plasticity to avoid the tectonics and to really focus on kind of on architecture as a whole, and the time components in architecture. Malevich is a canonical figure in suprematism. His pupil, Lisitsky, was an interesting figure. He started as an assistant to Malevich, and he worked in the suprematist architecture school during the 1920s. And what is interesting with Lisitsky, or one interesting aspect, is his prune variations that he developed as immediate stops between architecture and painting. And when I say immediate stops between architecture and painting, I also like you to think about back to Gideon's argument about separating the architect and the scientist. I mean, also to separate architect and artist implies a kind of issues. This separation between different kind of disciplines imply often problematics, and Lisitsky already in the 1920s were trying to find out ways of how to find connections between painting and architecture, and his prune variations were explicit examples and experiments of how to render these kinds of intersections between architecture and painting. One architect that I always was very, very influenced by suprematism was Zaha Hadid. I think here in these renderings, and particularly this rendering to the left for her competition entry to the Peak Leisure Club in a club in Hong Kong from the early 1980s, I think you see the similarities between Lisitsky and her way of thinking about space. Zaha talks a lot about suprematism, for this competition entry, I just pulled up this side plan, which I think is a quite beautiful side plan, and
it's a way to represent architecture on a site with a quite dramatic topography, like the Hong Kong site, which I think is a good example for all of you who will be developing these kinds of site plans quite soon in your own projects. And Zaha, talking Zaha and suprematism, just not that long ago, in 2010, Zaha was commissioned to design an exhibition on suprematist art in Zurich, in Switzerland, where she also included her own works. These are images, pictures from this exhibition, where you see works of Malevich. This red square in the middle here, I think, is a Malevich. I don't know who is the artist of this painting to the right here. She showcased, or this exhibition showcased works by Elisitsky, by Malevich, both who are suprematists, Alexander Rodchenko, who was a constructivist, and of her own works, Zaha Hadid's works. What I think is interesting with this exhibition is you see here also how she utilizes the laws of the perspective to design the exhibition. She's drawing these forms on the walls and on the floors and on the roofs and in the ceiling to render a perspective view into the space of the gallery. So basically, when you walk by this gallery, you look through the windows, you will see this force drawing you inside this exhibition. As you see here, I think it's important to remember and to see that she intersects ideas of non-Euclidean geometries, or the idea of going pass by the Euclidean perception of space with a perspective. Thus, never think about one or the other is more important. It's always about to intersect the two. To challenge this dichotomy that Gideon is talking about, that also Deleuze and Guattari are talking about in their article. And I think, to me, this exhibition designed by Zaha really points to the necessity of mastering different kinds of geometries when working with space. And we of course know the buildings Zaha has designed, throughout the 21st century. Here are a few examples. Hong Kong U, the Poly U in Hong Kong. I lived just next to that building when I lived in Hong Kong for 2 years. I saw the end of construction of the building. It's a fantastic building. It's absolutely astonishing in its location on the site and how it operates in the urban fabric. The Guangdong Opera House I never visited. Perhaps next time I'm traveling to Hong Kong and the region, I'll take a trip to Guangzhou. But if you ever go to Hong Kong, I truly recommend you to visit Poly U. Amazing project, really. I will now start to introduce concepts and terminologies that not necessarily are non-Euclidean, but in different ways offer alternatives to this mere Cartesian realities of Euclidean space that we have been talking about. And I will start talking about the oblique, the theory of the oblique. And I'm starting here because I don't think Zaha could be possible to talk about without the ideas of the oblique forms, the oblique architecture. And then to talk about this theory, I go to Paul Virilio. We haven't read Paul Virilio for today. It's a friend, or he was a French philosopher. Unfortunately, passed away a couple of years ago. And Virilio, he focused his thinking on perception. on time and speed and on war. And he was a canonical photographer in this aspect, and he founded, together with the architects Claude Parent and André Bloch, he founded in the 1960s a group called Groupe Espace in Paris. And Virilio is very interested in perception of space. And he argues that weight and gravity, they are key elements in the organization of space. Virilio, in his philosophy, he was thinking about how our perception of space has been shaped by geometrical rules in the Renaissance perspective. So now, I hope you can, what I've been talking about, the Renaissance, the Euclidean geometries, the Renaissance perspective, the distinction between the Painley perspective and the Renaissance perspective, and how this all plays out through mathematics, through the rules of geometry, into Cartesian space. I hope you can somehow keep that in your back of your head right now, when we start to move into the oblique, into Virilio. And I will use a text from Virilio. I can send it to the ones of you that are interested. But in this text, Virilio, he says, and now I will quote him, he says that the Renaissance perspective can't be separated from the orientation effect of the field of vision caused by gravity, and also by the frontal dimension of the canvas, which is never at slant. Both painting and research on perspective have always been conducted on a frontal dimension. It's always been conducted on a frontal dimension. And remember what I talked about the posture, about the perspective being drawn as a vertical thing on a wall. It's a piece of two-dimensional surface that mimics a three-dimensional representation of space, which is exact, thus you can measure in this perspective. In the representation of space, you can measure, you can relate that measure to the kind of real circumstance of space that it represents, right? But it's always vertical. It's always a posture of space. And Virilio was interested in this vertical posture that founded the perspective. The flat canvas, it was positioned on an easel, etc., etc. When you start to incline planes, like what is happening here, to get rid of verticality, the relationship to the horizon changes. And this gives you a different way of moving your body in relation to gravity, which affects your perception of space. And this basically affects your behavior. And because the behavior that you as a user will change when you climb up a slide or kind of slide down instead of moving on a flat surface. And this interest of Virilio in the oblique and in behavior, it resonates with Lewis-Woods. This picture really goes out to Maria, who works with organic shapes inside rigid grids, and to Edna, who is also interested in behavior. I mean, Lebesgue, he was explicit about how architecture design is really an instrument of controlling human behavior. I mean, that's what we are doing through our design. We control the way humans behave. And Lebesgue, he was interested in showing what could happen if we lived by a different set of rules, if we used other kinds of rules to shape our behaviors, that the ones that are normative, that the ones that are kind of imposed upon us. For Lebesgue, these rules were everything in society. He was critical against most of the rules that kind of dictates our world, but also to the rules of geometry,
which are the Euclidean rules of geometry, the foundation of Cartesian space, the Cartesian grid, etc., etc. I think I took this section from his Havana project, which I think it's a project in Havana that Lebes did in 1994. That is, I think, a beautiful section that kind of tells this story about a space that kind of goes on the virtue of these kinds of different rules and really challenges most rules of how to behave in this space. And I will quote Paul Virilio here now, quite a long quote where he's writing about the oblique, which he argues is he says that the oblique is a critique of orthogonality. It's a critique of large blocks of flats that were built at a time like sugar lamps. The intention was to go beyond orthogonality, beyond Euclidean geometry, towards an architecture based on a non-Euclidean geometry, on topology. The oblique function is the architectonic implementation of topology, leaving Euclid's grid surfaces for the oriented surfaces of topology. The function of the oblique is application of topology to architecture as a whole, and not only to parking garages or to Guggenheim Museum. It's like saying Euclidean geometry has built architecture from early history up till modernity. Tomorrow we will build with topology, end of quote. That's a state of Paul Virilio. So then, what is topology? Well, you all have read the article by Jane and Mark Barry about topology for today. I will talk about a little bit. I think Gediminas will continue talking about topology tomorrow. No, not at all. It's an important topic, and it's worth talking a lot about. It's only good if we overlap here. Topology is a geometry of relations, and this differs from the Euclidean or the Cartesian geometries, which are absolutes, which are universal truths, right? So here we have a geometry of relations, and there is a very important scholar called Branko Kolarevic. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correct, but he argued, and I'm quoting him, the notion of topology has particularly potentiality for architecture, as emphasis shifts away from particular forms of expression to relations that exist between and within an existing site and a proposed program. So basically, the same topological structure could be geometrically manifested in an infinite number of forms. Architects have been interested in topology since kind of the late 20th century, like in the 1990s. I pulled out this, the Möbius house by Lund Studio, who worked with the Möbius strip. And I need to also say that topology can be expressed through different structures. One structure one topological structure is the Möbius strip, which we have here as the kind of main source of inspiration for the Lund Studio's Möbius house in 1997. You may or may not debate how successful it is. Not making any values about that. But still, it was a metaphor for this house. And here we have another topological structure that you may or may not heard about, the Klein bottle, which was used as the metaphor for McBride Charles Ryan's Klein bottle house in Melbourne from 2008. I started with this picture because I think it's a quite successful image to show the relationships between the entrance, the outdoor entrance, and how that kind of move through the building and becomes part of the inverted interior-exterior kind of relationships that is emphasized through this Klein-Bottle metaphor. We see here how the process of transforming the Klein-Bottle metaphor into building quite successful and a beautiful piece, I think. And here I will talk about my own interest in the topological structure called homomorphism. And I will use one of my own projects to discuss why I'm interested in this, what this means to the construction of architecture. So homomorphism is a continuous stretching and bending of the object into a new form. You see it here rendered on the left side, when the cup can seamlessly becoming a donut. And Branko Kulavec says that the quality of homomorphism is particularly interesting as focus is on the relational structure of an object and not on its geometry. The same topological structure could be geometrically manifested in an infinite number of forms. And to me, I use this in order to work on a building that I was commissioned for a couple of years ago. I will not give a long presentation about this. I will try to focus on why topology here became a very important strategy to work with in different kinds of way for the design and for the realization of this building. It's a commission to design a small addition to a neoclassical house at the Rå, just south of Helsingborg, just 1 hour from here. And as you see on this site plan, so this is the site plan before we started to work on this building, and you see the main building here to the left, the photograph of it. As you may see on the site plan, the only location to add this small addition was at the corner of this lot, where Ljungmansgatan meets with Rogängargatan here, in the corner location. And this created some problems because it was the most exposed area of the lot, and we knew that this fact will create a lot of problems for us in the building permit process. So this site is historically is an historical landmark. It has harsh regulation in terms of historical preservation to it. So we developed a design concept which was basically consisted in two things. We work with, because it was a corner lot, we work with scale variations through movement. I mean, when you move along a corner, there is a constant movement. And that movement we wanted to orchestrate a variation of small scales, because that would break down the impression of the building, make the building have a less impact on the location and create a better communication with the scale of the human being. Thus, hopefully, it would create less impact on the actual site, which is this kind of very exposed corner on this lot. And the other concept was to work with surfaces in topology covered with tar paper, and the tar paper was used as a reference to the tectonics of the site, to this area, which is a fisherman's village where tar paper is used a lot on small buildings. So these two concepts were kind of the founding principles for the design process. Now, we experienced a lot of problem in the building permit process at the municipality. A lot of discussions about how to orchestrate this building on this site, because it's a neoclassical building that it needs to stand next to. It has a contemporary approach. Thus, we
we had to change the geometry quite a lot in order to respond to requirements from the city in terms of sight lines, in terms of transparencies and dimensions in envelopes, etc., etc. There's a lot of requirements that came from the municipality during the building permit process. And we experienced that by working with topology, we were able to change the geometry of this building without losing the concept. The concept was explicit throughout the entire process, even if the geometry changed in accordance with negotiations with the municipality. Thus, we could keep the architectural quality in the concept throughout this process of negotiation. And topology was actually the means of facilitating that for us as architects. But there was another aspect of topology that would be very important for the construction process of this building. Here is just the site plan, just to show it to you, how it's located. It's very close to Dr. Mandrup's kindergarten. If you ever go to check it out, you can just swing by and check out this little building. And here is the plan drawing of the building. But I will show you the two main drawings, construction drawings for this building, and to explain why topology was so important for the construction process. I mean, after you get the building permit, you need to construct the building, right? So, in this process, we developed the construction drawings, and we see here. What you see here is the slab plan. It's the plan of the slab. And now you may sit on pretty small screens, but if you can see the measurements on this slab, you may realize that they are very, very detailed and exact. We use measurements here like 71 degrees between in the construction of the slab. Very extremely detailed measurements. The contractor got crazy when he saw this construction plan of the slab. But we told him, you need to build this exactly like this in order for the building envelope to connect and to come together as a topological surface. So creating an exact slab, quite complicated exact slab, was very important, together with a series of drawings like this. What we control here is basically only one thing. It's the inclination and the length of a series of joists, of wooden joists. If you can see these measures, you see that they're also highly detailed. We talk about measurements like 3,004 millimeters. I think I have a very small screen myself. The measurements are really detailed. You normally don't see these kinds of details in construction drawings of the wood frame construction. But here we provided 3 or 4 drawings with these kinds of measurements that the contractor could very easily just take a wooden joist, cut it, and very quickly and assemble it. And if you were following these instructions, the entire topological the framework for the topological surface just was there. I mean, as an associated surface that came together. So very little amount of instructions for the contractor. The topology concept provides the architects to give very little instructions to the contractor. But in order to do that, the architect needs to really work through the geometry and the construction in detail. And then you see here how we modeled each and every wooden joists in this wood frame construction. We controlled each and every millimeter of this topological surface. And to me, that is a quality during the construction process because of 2 things. First of all, the architect is able to minimize the amount of instruction for the contractor, which minimizes the errors on the construction site, but also the price. It can also minimize the cost of construction. But secondly, it gives the architect, it gives the control of the building to the architect. The architect has the control. Without the architect, you can never build this, because the architect knows exactly where to control the measurements which will make the topological surface to come together. So it gives us more power to the construction process, which I think is very, very important. Here is the rendering that we used for the city and for the client to show the building. And here are some photographs of the final project. You see here these surfaces, these topological surfaces. Now the change around the project when you come into the entrance part of it. Here are some interior images, how it looks on the interior. So basically, but if you ever swing by a row, you may take a look at the project. It's there. So another kind of 15 minutes, then we are done, 10 or 15 minutes. I just want to briefly mention a couple of more concepts, and we start here with the fold, which I think is an important concept to talk about when we talk about topology. The fold basically starts with Greg Lynn in the early 1990s, where he is interested to rethink architecture by countering two postmodern conditions that were kind of ruling the discourse back in the kind of 1980s and early 90s. Greg basically thinks about how to develop a new path for architecture that goes beyond these two conceptions. And I won't go into these two conceptions. We can talk about it later if you're interested in it. But what is important is that Greg he found a philosophical argument that supported his ideas in this book. It's a book by Gilles Deleuze, where Gilles Deleuze provides a philosophical argument to support the idea that Greg had. And more importantly, Deleuze he postulates, the figure of the fold in this philosophy, and this research gave birth to a logic of kind of integrated differences in form within a continuous and yet heterogenic system of how this form is coming together. And I used this site plan here of a model of Peter Eisenman to try to explain this a little more explicitly. And Greg worked for Peter Eisenman when he was developing these theories. And we see here how Eisenman, he makes, this is a competition entry that Eisenman makes in the earlier kind of mid 1990s for a church design in Rome. And we see how the landscape and the building kind of it comes together in one formal system. And this formal system kind of resembles this theory that Greg works out, where folding becomes a design tool to integrate different kind of spatial phenomena within a continuous yet heterogeneous system, right? We couldn't really tell the difference between the building and the ground if it weren't for the colors on the model here. So we see how architectural landscape could become a continuous kind of heterogeneous system through the fold as a concept. In
in this particular project here, the fold is quite literally interpreted through Eisenmann's working process, where I basically fold kind of material, right? I mean, take a piece of paper and fold it. It's a process of folding materials in order to start to shape these kinds of spatial qualities or these geometries that come out of this this process. But this process doesn't need to be literal in terms of form. I mean, with the softwares that were developed and that Greg were interested in, this process of folding didn't have to relate that literally in terms of shape, as Eisenmann's products were showing there in the mid-90s. We could rather think about form in terms of continuous differentiations according to incidents or possibilities that are rendered and visualized here in this kind of rendering. And to me, this really goes to Olivia's project in the class, which really is based on a continuous differentiation according to incidents and accidents. Now, you haven't read Deleuze's text on the fold for this lecture, but you have read Deleuze and Guattari's idea about smooth and striated, and I think that was more important to read because it starts to form a quite good conclusion for this lecture, because this is a text that is canonical, and I think all of you should have read once in your lifetime. Deleuze, he offers different tools to use when thinking about the geometries that all of you are working with now, and to position them in relation to most of the architecture that Hythero has been exposed to here at the school, which often tends to be kind of boxy, Cartesian kind of constructs. This text here, I think, it correlates with Gideon's observation about the dichotomy of science and art that we started to talk about, where they present two kinds of a spatial concept, which is the smooth and the striated. You see here how our world as designers starts to kind of become kind of operated by these dichotomies. I mean, we have the scientist and the artist. We have the artist and the architect. Here we have the smooth and the striated. And we have Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometries. And I think what really is important to think about is what the Deleuze and Guattari writes in the beginning of the article, that we always need to think about these two such conditions, such dichotomies being intersected, overlaid, and kind of informing one another, and that helps us to pursue into new experiences and to pursue innovations in what we are doing. And just to give you a little hint on this text, I mean, it's a rather difficult text, but it's also possible to interpret it in many different ways. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari explicitly refers felt to the smooth space and fabric to the striated space. They talk about the smooth space being a non-Euclidean space, while the striated space is a Euclidean or Cartesian space. So we see here how these dichotomies kind of plays out in the way we think about space, about architecture, and the way we think about representation about these spaces. One geometry that they do mention, and where they say that it's perhaps the essence of it may give a mathematical definition to the smooth space. That's the fractals. And I won't talk much about the fractals here. They may be mentioned tomorrow. I don't know.
But if you are interested in fractals, I suggest you to go to Benoit Mandelbrot's theories on fractals, which starts to introduce you to kind of geometrical concepts also beyond the Euclidean kind of traditional geometries and concepts about space. Fractals in architecture are often rendered, through Islamic art and architecture, but also in Jean Nouvel's Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris. You see the facades kind of also reassembles a kind of Islamic tradition in arts and crafts, and the fractal is an explicit reference and metaphor that is used in that project. So that's all. I don't know how many of you that still are with us. I'm really curious about to see when I check. Fredrik is here, at least. Then there's a lot of closed cameras, but that's okay. No more. Axel and Daniel. Yeah, here you go. And Andre, hi. And Mia, wow.
I'm still alive.
You're still alive? Oh, good. It's a long lecture. Yeah. To conclude, what I hope I have provided you with here in this long lecture is that I hope you have improved your references to what the perspective is and how it has affected our space conception, the way we think about space. And I also hope that you can comprehend a trajectory now from Euclidean geometries to kind of non-Euclidean geometries, and sense a logic, that there is a logic in the transition of between these kinds of spaces. It's nothing strange that we are doing here. It's completely logic, and it's a trajectory that we need to see to really comprehend it and to draw upon it, to understand it. I also hope you have realized all these multiple dichotomies in the world that needs to be challenged. The smooth and the striated, art and science, Euclidean, non-Euclidean, indoor, outdoor, etc., etc. And our job as architects, we are the experts in the construction industry to synthesize such dichotomies. And by starting to understand how these things needs to overlap, how different kinds of geometries, different types of conceptions about space needs to overlap and intertwine and inform each other, we will be able to synthesize things through the construction of buildings, of cities, which will be able to improve and introduce innovation in those processes. And I also think and hope that I've given you access to concepts and theories about space and geometry. This will go on tomorrow with Gedmina's lecture. He will provide you with more of these things. But I hope the historical kind of foundation and the emergence through history has been presented to you. And I'll make sure that you get this lecture. We can upload it on the site website, on the course website. So questions, thoughts, reflections, ideas are always difficult in this forum. But if there is anyone that wants to say something, it's a pretty long lecture, and I really appreciate you still hang in there. Most of you have closed or muted. Gediminas, what do you think?